an uneducated farm boy who became the Civil War's most brilliant cavalry officer, Nathan Bedford Forrest, reportedly had 30 horses shot out from under him. Enlisting as a private in a mounted rifle company, Forrest rose to command Confederate cavalry in 3 states as Major General, but his tactical genius was clouded by his savage 1864 attack on Fort Pillow and his post-war career as a Ku Klux Klan leader. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a Confederate cavalry commander during the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865. He was often described as a born military genius. His rule of action, "Get there first with the most men," became one of the most often quoted statements of the war. He is also one of the most controversial figures from the Civil War era. His command was responsible for the mass unaliving of African-American Union troops stationed at Fort Pillow, Tennessee on April 12, 1864, and he served as the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan in the early years of Reconstruction. Welcome to yet another interesting video segment. In this video, we are going to be examining a historical figure, Nathan Bedford Forrest, early leader of Ku Klux Klan, involved in promoting white supremacy and racial violence post-Civil War in the United States. Before we continue, don't forget to support our efforts by hitting that like button before you. Share with your family and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening narrative, and kindly subscribe to keep the channel growing. Your support means a lot to us. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a self-taught man who made his fortune as a cotton planter and trader of enslaved people. At the outbreak of the Civil War, he raised a cavalry and fought with distinction through much of the war. Controversy surrounds his degree of responsibility at the Battle of Fort Pillow, where nearly 300 surrendering black soldiers were struck down. After the war, he had become a businessman and was associated with the Ku Klux Klan. Born dirt poor in the small town of Chapel Hill, Tennessee on July 13, 1821, Nathan Bedford Forrest grew up with no education except the backwoods skills of hunting, tracking, and survival. His father, William, a blacksmith, died when Forrest was 16. He went to work for his uncle, Jonathan, at a tailor shop in Hernando, Mississippi. On March 10, 1845, 4 men came to settle a score with Forrest and his uncle and mentor Jonathan, with whom he had entered into a business partnership in Hernando. The altercation turned violent, with Jonathan falling mortally wounded from a bullet intended for his nephew. Forrest continued the struggle, shooting and killing 2 of his attackers, and with his ammunition exhausted, he chased the other 2 off with a bowie knife. The act was so within the norms of Southern upcountry society that the townspeople later made Forrest both constable and coroner, as well as a lieutenant in the state militia. That same year, Forrest married Mary Ann Montgomery. The couple would have 2 children over the course of their marriage. In 1851, he relocated to Memphis and moved naturally from trading livestock to selling real estate and enslaved people. Memphis was then ideally situated between the enslaved people of the Upper South who were sold down the river from their old Kentucky home to the hellish cotton and sugar plantations in the Delta, and Forrest prospered, socially and financially, from the increasing demand. Throughout his antebellum career, which included a term as a Memphis city alderman, Forrest's ambition, popularity, business acumen, lack of formal education, and temper were all on full display. They remained so during Forrest's apparently successful but ultimately failed military career. At the start of the Civil War, Forrest enlisted as a private in the Tennessee Mounted Rifles. As more men joined the outfit, Forrest personally purchased guns, uniforms, and supplies to equip the unit. He was soon promoted to lieutenant colonel and placed in charge of raising and training his own battalion. After his promotion, Forrest began acting as a semi-independent cavalry commander. His command conducted raids against Union supply and communication lines, depots and garrisons in many states in the war's Western theater. Forrest's campaigns were especially detrimental to Union General Ulysses S. Grant's Vicksburg campaign, that is, the campaign by Union forces to take the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi, which lay on the east bank of the Mississippi River, halfway between Memphis, north, and New Orleans, south. Some contemporaries and historians have argued that Forrest forestalled Vicksburg's fall by several months. In February 1862, Forrest and his troops were cornered by Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Fort Donelson, Kentucky. His command refused to surrender to Grant, and Union forces charged in to take the fort. Forrest led 700 cavalrymen through the snow, past the Union lines, and escaped to Nashville, where he coordinated evacuation efforts. 2 months later, in the aftermath of the Battle of Shiloh at Fallen Timbers, Forrest was commanding the rear guard of the withdrawing Confederate troops. In an attempt to hit the enemy one more time, Forrest drove deep the advancing Union line far ahead of his own men and found himself surrounded by Union troops. After he emptied his 2 revolvers, he drew his saber and began slashing at the oncoming enemy. One soldier stuck his rifle into Forrest's side and fired, lifting Forrest off his saddle and lodging a mini-ball near his spine. Forrest regained control of his horse, remounted, and took off. As Union forces shot after him, he reached down and grabbed an unsuspecting Union soldier and brought him up on the back of his horse, then dumping the man to the ground once he was in the clear. Beginning in December 1862 and well into 1863, Forrest and his cavalry harassed General Ulysses S. Grant's forces as they prepared for an attack on Vicksburg. Cutting off communication lines and raiding stores of supplies, Forrest relied on guerrilla tactics and never fully engaged the enemy's superior forces. As a result, General Grant was forced to revise his strategy. Eventually, after a 6-month siege, Vicksburg fell, but Forrest continued to attack boldly and retreat swiftly, frustrating one Union commander after the other and further expanding his reputation. In May 1863, Forrest foiled Union Colonel Abel D. Straight's attempt to cut the Western and Atlantic Railroad, a vital supply line for the Confederacy's Army of Tennessee. Later, Forrest joined that army in time to take part in the Battle of Chickamauga from September 19 to 20, 1863, where his command held the army's right flank before pursuing the retreating Union forces. Following the battle, General Braxton Bragg, the Army of Tennessee's commander, stripped Forrest of his command because the two had argued. One of numerous such acrimonious encounters Forrest had with superior officers during the war. Although Forrest had threatened Bragg's life, Bragg, realizing Forrest's importance to the Confederate war effort, never reported the incident. Forrest, on the other hand, refused to take any further orders from Bragg, but instead of accepting Forrest's resignation, Confederate President Jefferson Davis promoted him to Major General. Forrest was tasked with raising, equipping, and training a new cavalry command to, again, operate semi-independently. With his fresh, if relatively untried division, Forrest resumed his raids against Union forces. Soon he found himself embroiled in one of the war's most controversial and brutal episodes. On April 12, 1864, Forrest's command surrounded Fort Pillow, a small Union installation on the Mississippi River about 40 miles, that is, 65 kilometers north of Memphis. After failing to negotiate the fort's surrender, Forrest ordered his men to take the outnumbered garrison, which was made up of African Americans, Southern Unionists, and Confederate deserters, by force. The battle that ensued was characterized by close-quarters combat, chaos, and the almost total breakdown of command and control. Despite contradictory evidence regarding Forrest's orders and response to the actions of his troops, it is clear that in many instances, Forrest's men killed African American soldiers who were attempting to surrender. During the battle and subsequent mass killing, between 277 and 295 Union troops, most of whom were black, were killed. Many Union and some Confederate sources claimed that Confederate forces entering the fort fired on Union troops as they surrendered. Witnesses reported the rebels shouted, "No quarter!" as they shot and bayoneted the Union forces, specifically targeting the black troops as they ran. The Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, which was composed primarily of radical Republicans, concluded that Confederates killed most of the Union soldiers after they had surrendered. In contrast, many of Forrest's men claimed that Union soldiers kept their weapons and fired back at the Confederates as they fled. Historians agree a mass killing did occur, but differ in their conclusions over whether the killing was premeditated or occurred in the heat of battle. As the war moved on through 1864 and into 1865, Forrest experienced some victories and defeats, but neither strong enough to turn the tide of war toward the South or to destroy his army completely. In 1865, Forrest and his men were struggling just to avoid capture. Upon hearing of General Robert E. Lee's, that is, the leading Confederate general during the U.S. Civil War, surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Forrest chose to surrender his forces in May 1865. After the war, Forrest returned to Memphis, Tennessee, and entered private business as a lumber merchant and planter, later becoming president of the Selma, Marion, and Memphis Railroad. In the late 1860s, he associated himself with a fledgling secret society called the Ku Klux Klan, and his notoriety increased when, in 1867, he became the first Grand Wizard of the original Ku Klux Klan, KKK, a secret hate organization that employed terror in pursuit of its white supremacist agenda. Although the extent of Forrest's influence in the KKK is disputed, at the very least, his prestige served to expand membership rolls. The KKK embarked upon a campaign of intimidation and violence against Southern blacks and Republicans until Forrest ordered the organization disbanded in 1869. Nevertheless, local chapters of the KKK continued to be active, and Forrest was ordered to appear before a congressional hearing in 1871. In his sometimes contradictory testimony, he denied membership in the organization. A combination of age, exhaustion, and a conversion to Christianity seemed to have caused Forrest's fiery temper and racial attitudes to moderate in his later years. Forrest's post-war business career was not as lucrative as his antebellum ventures. He had exhausted his fortune during the war, and with the abolition of slavery he lost one of his most valuable avenues for making money. After serving as the president of the Selma, Marion, and Memphis Railroad in 1874, the railroad company failed and Forrest was forced to sell off many of his assets. He settled on managing a plantation manned by convict labor and spent his remaining years overseeing a prison camp near Memphis and living with his wife in a log cabin salvaged from this plantation. He died on October 29, 1877, reportedly from complications of diabetes. Over the years, Forrest has proved to be one of the Civil War's most controversial figures. He is remembered by some as a hero of Southern causes and was memorialized in statues and other monuments throughout the region. Unsurprisingly, given his culpability in the Fort Pillow mass killing and the formation of the KKK, Forrest and his image have come under attack by many sectors, especially from African Americans. On the other hand, many white Southerners continue to admire Forrest for his wartime record, common man origins, and masculine bearing. In recent decades, Forrest has come to rival the less controversial Robert E. Lee and Thomas Jackson, Stonewall, as the foremost human symbol of Confederate identity. Consequently, debates have emerged wherever Forrest has been commemorated. Schools, streets, and buildings named in the general's honor have sometimes been renamed, and health sciences, which were formerly Nathan Bedford Forrest, in Memphis, the location of the general's grave, has been the focus of both KKK and civil rights demonstrations. The park was once also home to a large equestrian statue of Forrest, but it was removed in 2017 amid a nationwide movement to remove or relocate Confederate monuments. The people who erected the statue of Forrest did so to celebrate white supremacy. They wanted black Memphians to remember their proper place, and that the spirit of the Klan could always rise again if they forgot their place. Perhaps not in the same form. Rather than a hooded man on horseback, the Klan might return in the form of a stringent voter ID law or an exclusionary zoning ordinance, but with the same goal, which is to maintain the superiority of white folks over black folks. After the death of Forrest in Memphis in October 1877, he was first buried in Elmwood Cemetery. His wife, Mary Ann Montgomery Forrest, later died in 1893 and was buried alongside him. In 1904, the couple was exhumed and reinterred in Forest Park in Memphis, which became Health Sciences Park in 2013. The city changed the name of the park to distance themselves from controversy over Forrest's racist legacy. A large statue of Forrest mounted on a horse stood in the park, but was taken down in December 2017. Though the State Historical Commission does not allow cities and counties to remove war memorials from public places without permission, the city of Memphis sold the park to the non-profit Memphis Green Space on December 20, 2017, and the Forrest Monument, as well as a monument honoring Jefferson Davis, was taken down that night. The Sons of Confederate Veterans fought the removal of both statues, citing Tennessee's cemetery law and heritage protection law when making the claims. Ultimately, the group reached an agreement with the non-profit in 2020 to have the general and his wife's remains removed from the park and placed in another area. Health Sciences Park has been a prominent location for Black Lives Matter protests in recent years, with activists previously painting the words "Black Lives Matter" on the walkway leading up to the tomb. The removal of the bodies was said to last 3 weeks and would likely not be done in time for Juneteenth Festival, a celebration of the emancipation of slaves, which would take place in the park on the 18th of June and the 19th of June. In June 2021, the remains of Forrest and his wife were exhumed from Health Sciences Park, where they had been buried for over 100 years and where a monument of him once stood. They were later reburied in Columbia, Tennessee. In July 2021, Tennessee officials voted to move Forrest's bust from the state capitol to the Tennessee State Museum. Initially, the family wanted the remains of the general and his wife to stay in Memphis, But it was ultimately decided to move the bodies to a museum which was located close to where Mr. Forrest grew up. Lee Miller, a spokesperson for the Sons of Confederate Veterans, confirmed the move when speaking to Fox 13 Memphis. Initially, it was pretty sad that someone would want to remove a monument because everyone's history is important to everybody. But some people don't realize that, and they just want to get rid of history, which is wrong, and then secondly, removing a grave. That's not a good idea either. But as things progressed, we reached a compromise, he said. He'll be moving to a better place where he can be visited, respected, protected. It'll be a good site for the general, Mr. Miller told the local news station. The sale of the park to the non-profit group Memphis Green Space allowed the city to go around a state law that bars the removal of historical monuments from public spaces. In conclusion, Nathan Bedford Forrest was a complex and controversial figure. He was a brilliant military strategist who played a significant role in the Confederate Army. But he was also a racist who supported the Ku Klux Klan. Forrest was a flawed man, but he was also a product of his time. His actions shaped by the racism that was deeply ingrained in American society and in him. His legacy is a reminder of the dark side of American history. We must therefore learn from his mistakes and work to create a more just and equitable society for all. This brings us to the end of this video segment. Did you happen to learn a thing or two? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section below. We are always delighted to pick from your thoughts. Also, support our works by hitting that like button in front of you. Share with your families and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative. And kindly subscribe to help in building the rising membership of this channel. Your support means a great deal to us. Thank you for watching.